Excerpts from The White Slaves of England, published 1854, written by John C. Cobden. Chapter 9. Mental and Moral Condition of the White Slaves in Great Britain. The moral degradation and mental darkness of the labouring classes in Great Britain in the middle of the 19th century are appalling to contemplate. Beneath the wing of a government professedly Christian, there is sheltered a vast number of people who must be characterized as heathen, as fit subjects of missionary labours such as are freely given to the dark sons of India and Africa. They know nothing of God but his prevailing name, and the Bible's light is hid from them as completely as if its pages were inscribed with Egyptian hieroglyphs. Their code of morals is the creature of their sensual inclinations, their intelligence seemingly the superior instinct of the animal. Scotland is far beyond other portions of Great Britain in the moral and mental cultivation of its people, but there is a large class in that country to which the above observations must be justly applied. According to Kay, more than half the poor in England and Wales cannot read and write, while the majority of the remainder know nothing of science, history, geography, music or drawing, and very little of scripture history. In the great mercantile and manufacturing towns it is true that poor men, if they defer their marriage and have no extraordinary encumbrances, may improve their condition, but scarcely any facilities are offered for their acquiring the intelligence necessary for the control of passion. The schools in the towns are wretchedly arranged and managed. Many are nothing more than dame schools, conducted often in cellars or garrets by poor women, who know how to read, but who often know nothing else. The school for the peasants are still fewer in number, and inefficient in character, and hence the result that the English peasantry are more ignorant and demoralized, less capable of helping themselves, and more pauperized than those of any other country in Europe, if we except Russia, Turkey, South Italy and some parts of the Austrian Empire. A writer in recent number of Household Words makes some remarkable statements in regard to the ignorance of the English masses. Wherever we turn, ignorance, not always allied to poverty, stares us in the face. If we look in the Gazette at the list of partnerships dissolved, not a month passes but some unhappy man, rolling perhaps in wealth but wallowing in ignorance, is put to the experimentum crucis of his mark. The number of petty jurors in rural districts especially, who can only sign with a cross, is enormous. It is not unusual to see parish documents of great local importance defaced with the same humiliating symbol by persons whose office shows them to be not only men of mark but men of substance. We have printed already specimens of the partial ignorance which passes under the ken of the post office authorities, and we may venture to assert that such specimens of penmanship and orthography are not to be matched in any other country in Europe. A housewife in humble life need only turn to the file of her tradesman's bills to discover hieroglyphs which render them so many arithmetical puzzles. In short, the practical evidences of the low ebb to which the plainest rudiments of education in this country has fallen are too common to bear repetition. We cannot pass through the streets We cannot enter a place of public assembly or ramble in the fields without the gloomy shadow of ignorance sweeping over us. The rural population is indeed in a worse plight than the other classes. We quote, with the attestation of our own experience, the following passage from one of a series of articles which have recently appeared in a morning newspaper. Taking the adult class of agricultural labourers, it is almost impossible to exaggerate the ignorance in which they live and move and have their being. As they work in the fields, the external world has some hold upon them through the medium of their senses, but to all the higher exercises of intellect, they are perfect strangers. You cannot address one of them without being at once painfully struck with the intellectual darkness which enshrouds them. There is in general neither speculation in his eyes, nor intelligence in his countenance. The whole expression is more than that of an animal than of a man. He is wanting, too, in the erect and independent bearing of a man. When you accost him, if he is not insolent, which he seldom is, he is timid and shrinking, his whole manner showing that he feels himself at a distance from you, greater than should separate any two classes of men. He is often doubtful when you address, and suspicious when you question him. He is seemingly oppressed with the interview while it lasts, and obviously relieved when it is over. These are the traits which I can affirm them to possess as a class, after having come in contact with many hundreds of farmer labourers. They belong to a generation for whose intellectual culture little or nothing was done. As a class, they have no amusements beyond the indulgence of sense. In 9 cases out of 10, recreation is associated in their minds with nothing higher than sensuality. I have frequently asked clergymen and others if they often find the adult peasant reading for his own or others' amusement. The invariable answer is that such a sight is seldom or never witnessed. In the first place, the great bulk of them cannot read. In the next, a large portion of those who can do so with so much difficulty to admit of the exercise being an amusement to them. Again, few of those who can read with comparative ease have the taste for doing so. It is but justice to them to say that many of those who cannot read have bitterly regretted in my hearing their inability to do so. I shall never forget the tone in which an old woman in Cornwall intimated to me what a comfort it would be to her could she only read her Bible in her lonely hours. From statistics given by Kay, it is apparent that the proportional amount of crime to population calculated in 2 years, 1841 and 1847, was greater in almost all the agricultural counties of England than it was in the mining and manufacturing districts. The peasants of England must be subjected to a singularly demoralizing system to produce so terrible a result. The extreme poverty of the agricultural labourers is the great stimulant to crime of all kinds, but the darkness of ignorance is also a powerful agent. Poverty renders peasants desperate, and they are too ignorant to see the consequences of crime. In a former part of this work, it was mentioned that the miserable cottages in which the peasants are compelled to reside have considerable influence in demoralizing them. This deserves to be further illustrated. The majority of the cottages are but 2 small rooms, in one of which husband and wife women, boys and girls, and his wife all sleep together, Kay says. The accounts we receive from all parts of the country show that these miserable cottages are crowded to an extreme, and that the crowding is progressively increasing. People of both sexes and of all ages, both married and unmarried, parents, brothers, sisters, and strangers, sleep in the same room, and often in the same beds. One gentleman tells us of 6 people of different sexes and ages, 2 of whom, man and wife, sleeping in the same bed, 3 with their heads at the top and 3 with their heads at the foot of the bed. Another tells us of adult uncles and nieces sleeping in the same room, close to each other. Another of the uncles brothers sleep in the same bed together. Another of the adult brothers and sisters sleep in the same room, with the brother and his wife to toil. Many tell us of beds. Another tells us of rooms so filled with beds that there is no space between them, but that brothers and sisters and parents crawl over each other, half naked, in order to get their respective resting places. Another of it being common for men and women, not being relations, to undress together in the same room, without any feeling of its being indelicate. Another of these cases where women have been delivered in bedrooms crowded with men, young women and children, and others mention facts of these crowded bedrooms, much too horrible to be alluded to. Nor are these solitary instances, but similar reports are given by gentlemen writing in all parts of the country. The young peasants, from their earliest years, are accustomed to sleep in the same bedrooms with people of both sexes, and they lose all sense of the indecency of such a life, taking wives before they are 20 years of age to sleep in the same room with their parents. The policy now pursued by the aristocratic landlords of clearing their estates tends to crowd the cottages which are allowed to remain, and thus the demoralization of the peasantry is stimulated. Adultery is the very largest form of vast amount of crimes which it is engendering. Magistrates, clergymen, sergeants, and parish officers bear witness that cases of incests are increasing in all parts of the country, and eminent writing represents the consequence of the state of peasant cottages in England and Wales in the following startling but unexaggerated terms. In 8 cases of 10, it is a cottage of 2 rooms. For a time, so far as war at least is concerned, this course is now even if they desired it. In this they pass with tolerable comfort, considering their notions of what comfort is. The first period of their to get to their beds. So long as the children are very young, the only evil connected with this is the physical one arising from crowding so many people together into what is generally a dingy, frequently a damp, and invariably an ill-ventilated apartment. But years steal on, and the family continues thus, bedded together. Some of its members may yet be in their infancy, but others of both sexes have crossed the line of puberty. But they are still together in the same room, the father and mother, the sons and the daughters, young men, young women, and children. Cousins too of both sexes are often thrown together into the same room, and not unfrequently into the same bed. I have also known of cases in which uncles slept in the same room with their grown-up nieces, and newly married couples occupied the same chamber with those long married, and with others marriageable but unmarried. A case also came to my notice, already alluded to in connection with another branch of the subject, in which two sisters who were married on the same day occupied adjoining rooms in the same hut, with nothing but a thin board partition, which did not reach the ceiling, between the two rooms, and a door in the partition, which only partly filled up the doorway. For years back, in those same two rooms have slept 12 people of both sexes and all ages. Sometimes, when there is but one room, a praiseworthy effort is made for the conservation of decency, but the hanging up of a piece of tattered cloth between the beds, which is generally all that is done in this respect, and even that but seldom, is but a poor set-off to the fact that a family which, in common decency, should, as regards sleeping accommodations, be separated at least into 3 divisions, occupying night after night but one and the same chamber. This is a frightful position for them to be in, when an infectious or epidemic disease enters into their abode. But this, important though it be, is the least important consideration connected with their circumstances. That which is most so is the effect produced by them upon their habits and morals. In the illicit intercourse to which such a position frequently gives rise, it is not always that the tie of blood is respected. Certain it is that when the relationship is even but 1 degree removed from that of brother and sister, that tie is frequently overlooked, and when the circumstances do not lead to such horrible consequences, the mind, particularly of the female, is wholly divested of that sense of decency and shame which, so long as they are preserved, are the chief safeguards of her chastity. She therefore falls an early and an easy prey to the temptations which beset her beyond the immediate circle of her family. People in the other spheres of life are but little aware of the extent to which this precocious demoralization of the female among the lower orders in the country it has proceeded. But how could it be otherwise? The philanthropist may exert himself in their behalf, the moralist may inculcate even the worldly advantage of a better course of life, and the minister of religion may warn them of the eternal penalties which they are incurring. But there is an instructor constantly at work, more potent than them all, instructor in mischief, of which they must get rid ere they can make any real progress in their laudable efforts, and that is the single bedchamber in the two-roomed cottage. Okay, so we've seen incidences of strong and a lot of instances of incest. So now we're going to look at crime and the types of crime. We need not be surprised to find that where so much misery prevails, crime is frightfully frequent. The Times of the 30th of November 1849 shows the terrible increase of crime in the last few years in Dorsetshire. The Times says, "We yesterday published in a very short compass some grave particulars of the unfortunate county of Dorset. It is not simply the old story of wages inadequate for life, hovels unfit for habitation, and misery and sin alternately claiming our pity and our disgust. This state of things is so normal that we really believe, so immemorial in that notorious county, that we should rather deaden than excite the anxiety of the public by a thrice told tale. What compels our attention just now is a sudden, rapid, and we fear a forced aggravation of these evils measured by the infallible test of crime. Dorsetshire is fast sinking into a slough of wretchedness, which threatens the peace and morality of the kingdom at large. The total number of convictions which, in 1846 was 798, and 1847 was 821, mounted up in 1848 to 950, and up to the special general session last Tuesday, December 1849, for less than 11 months of the present year, to the astonishing number of 1,193, being at the rate of 1,300 for the whole year. Unless something is done to stop this flood of crime, or the tide happily turns of itself, the county will have more than doubled its convictions within 4 years. Nor is it possible for us to take refuge in the thought that the increase is in petty offences. In no respect it is a light thing for a poor creature to be sent to jail, whatever be the offence. He has broken the laws of his country, and forfeited his character. His name and his morals are alike tainted with the jail. He is degraded and corrupted. If his spirit not be crushed, he is exasperated into perpetual hostility to wealth and power. It is then no light affair that a rural county, the abode of an ancient and respectable aristocracy, somewhat removed from the popular influences of the age, with a population of 175,043 by the late census, should produce in 4 years nearly 4,000 convictions, being at the rate of 1 conviction in that period for every 60 persons, or 12 householders. Alright, and before I continue, we're just going to deal with this little sentence here quite quickly. We might express our doubts for the real respectability of the ancient aristocracy of Dorsetshire. Let's not forget that many people, Christians particularly, were under protection of the monarchy, so clearly the monarchy got hijacked at some point, because they were respectable and things were running well at some point. So let's investigate other aspects of crime further down in this part of the book, because there's many pages. It's about 60 pages. The humane and able author of Letters on Rural Districts, published in the Morning Chronicle of London, thus speaks of the frightful immorality among the agricultural population of Norfolk and Suffolk counties. One species of immorality which is particularly prevalent in Norfolk and Suffolk is that of bastardy. With the exception of Hereford and Cumberland, there are no counties in which the percentage of bastardy is so high as it is in Norfolk, there being 53.1% above the average of England and Wales. In Suffolk it is 27% above, and in Essex 19.1% below the average. In the first named counties, and even in the latter one, though not to the same extent, there appears to be a perfect want of decency among the people. The immorality of the young women, said the rector of one parish to me, is literally horrible, and I regret to say it is on the increase in a most extraordinary degree. When I first came to the town, The mother of a bastard child used to be ashamed to show herself. The case is now quite altered. No person seems to think anything of it at all. When I first came to the town there was no such thing as a common prostitute in it. Now there is an enormous number of them. When I am called upon to see a woman confined with an illegitimate child, I endeavour to impress upon her the enormity of the offence, and there are no cases in which I receive more insult from those I visit than from such persons. They generally say they'll get on as well after all that is said and done, or all that is said about it, and if they never do anything worse than that, they shall get to heaven as well as other people. Another clergyman stated to me that he never recollected an instance of having married a woman who was not either pregnant at the time of her marriage, or who had had one or more children before her marriage. Again, a third clergyman told me that when he went to baptize the illegitimate child of one woman who was 35 years of age, and it was absolutely impossible for him to convince her that what she had done was wrong. There appears, said he, to be among the lower orders a perfect deadness of all moral feeling upon this subject. Many of the cases of this kind, which have come under my knowledge, evince such horrible depravity that I dare not attempt to lay them before the reader. Speaking to the wife of a respectable labourer on the subject, who had 7 children, one of whom was then confined with an illegitimate child, she excused her daughter's conduct by saying, "What was the poor girl to do? The chaps say that they won't marry 'em first, then the girls give way. I did the same myself with my husband." There was one case in Cozy in Norfolk, in which the woman told me there was one case in Cozy in Norfolk, in which the woman told me, without a blush crimsoning her cheek, that her daughter and self had each had a child by a sweep who lodged with them, and who promised to marry the daughter. The cottage in which these persons slept consisted of but one room, and there were 2 other lodgers who occupied beds in the same room, in one of which a young woman occasionally slept with the young man she was keeping company with. The other lodger was an old woman of 74 years of age. To such an extent is prostitution carried on in Norwich that out of the 656 licensed public houses and beer shops in the city, there are not less than 220 which are known to the police as common brothels, and although the authorities have the power of withholding the licenses, nothing is done to put a stop to the frightful vice. A want of chastity is universal among the female peasants of Wales, arising chiefly from the herding of many persons in the small cottages. In the vicinity of the mines the average of inhabitants to a house is said to be nearly 12. The Reverend John Griffin, vicar of Aberdare, says, "Nothing can be lower, I would say, more degrading, than the character in which the women stand relative to the men. The men and women, married as well as single, live in the same house and sleep in the same room. The men do not hesitate to wash themselves naked before the women. On the other hand, the women do not hesitate to change their undergarments before the men. Promiscuous intercourse is most common, is thought of as nothing, and the women do not lose caste by it. The Welsh are peculiarly exempt from the guilt of great crimes, but petty thefts, lying, cozening, every species of chicanery and drunkenness are common among the agricultural population, and are regarded as matters of course." So now we're going to look at another crime, infanticide. Infanticide was practised to a terrible extent in England and Wales. In most of the large provincial towns, burial clubs existed. A small sum is paid every year by the parent, and this entitles him to receive from £3 to £5 from the club on the death of the child. Many persons enter their children in several clubs, and as the burial of the child does not necessarily cost more than £1, or at the most £1.10, the parent realises a considerable sum after all the expenses are paid. For the sake of this, money, it has become common to cause the death of the children either by starvation, ill usage, or poison. No more horrible symptom of moral degradation could be conceived. Mr. Chadwick says, officers of these burial societies, relieving officers and others whose administrative duties put them in communication with the lowest classes in these districts, the manufacturing districts, express their moral conviction of the operation of such bounties to produce instances of the visible neglect of children of which they are witnesses. They often say, "You are not treating that child properly, it will not live. Is it in the club?" And the answer corresponds with the impression produced by the sight. Mr. Gardner, the clerk of Manchester Union, while registering... Wow, this is terrible. Mr. Gardner, the clerk of Manchester Union, while registering the causes of death, deemed the cause assigned by a labouring man for the death of a child unsatisfactory, and, staying to inquire, found that popular rumour assigned the death to wilful starvation. The child, according to a statement of the case, had been entered in at least 10 burial clubs, and its parents had 6 other children who only lived from 9 to 18 months respectively. They had received from several burial clubs £20 for one of these children, and they expected at least as much on account of this child. An inquest was held at Mr. Gardner's instance, when several persons who had known the deceased stated that she was a fine fat child shortly after her birth, but that she soon became quite thin, was badly clothed, and seemed as if she did not get a sufficiency of food. The jury, having expressed it as their opinion that the evidence of the parents was made up for the occasion and entitled to no credit, returned the following verdict: died through want of nourishment, but whether occasioned by a deficiency of food, or by disease of the liver and spine brought on by improper food and drink, or otherwise, does not appear. 2 similar cases came before Mr. Coppock, the clerk and superintendent register of the Stockport Union, in both of which he prosecuted the parties for murder. In one case, where 3 children had been poisoned with arsenic, the father was tried with the mother and convicted at Chester and sentenced. was the clear opinion of the medical officers that infanticide had been committed in Stockport to obtain the burial money. Such parents must be placed upon a level with the swine that devour their farrow. We are led to doubt whether they could sink much lower in the animal scale. Poverty and ignorance seem to have thoroughly quenched the spark of humanity. The author of Letters on Labour and the Poor in the Rural Districts, writing of the burial clubs in the eastern counties, says, "The suspicion that a great deal of foul play exists with respect to these clubs is supported not only by a comparison of the different rates of mortality, but it is considerably strengthened by the facts proved upon the trial of Mary May, the Reverend Mr. Wilkins, the Vicar of Wicks, who was mainly instrumental in bringing the case before a court of justice, stated to me that from the time of Mary May coming to live in his parish, he was determined to keep a very strict watch upon her movements, as he had heard that 14 of her children had previously died suddenly. A few weeks after her arrival in the parish, she called upon him to request him to bury one of her children. Upon his asking her which of the children it was, she told him it was Eliza, a fine healthy-looking child of 10 years old. Upon his expressing some surprise that she should have died so suddenly, she said, "Oh, sir, she went off like a snuff. All my other children did so too." A short time elapsed, and she again waited upon the vicar to request him to bury her brother as soon as he could. His suspicions were aroused, and he endeavoured to postpone the funeral for a few days, in order to enable him to make some inquiries. Not succeeding in obtaining any further information which would warrant further delay in burying the corpse, he most reluctantly proceeded in the discharge of his duty. About a week after the funeral, Mary May waited again upon him to request him to sign a certificate to the effect that her brother was in perfect health a fortnight before he died, that being the time at which, as it subsequently appeared, she had entered him as nominee in the Harwick Burial Club. Upon inquiring as to the reason of her desiring this certificate, she told him that unless she got it, she could not get the money for him from the club. This at once supplied the vicar with what appeared to be a motive for foul play on part of the woman. He accordingly obtained permissions to have the body of her brother exhumed. Doses of arsenic were detected and the woman was arrested. With the evidence given upon the trial, the reason is no doubt perfect, and it will be unnecessary for me to detail it. She was convicted. Previously to her execution, she refused to make any confession, but said, "If I were to tell all I know, I would give." Upon the trial with respect to some of her neighbours and accomplices, and with the extraordinary rate of mortality among the clubs, it certainly does appear that the general opinion with respect to the serious as members or nominees, still, as illustrating the evils arising from these clubs, I may state that many persons who are fully conversant with the working of such institutions have stated that they have frequently been shocked by hearing women of the lower classes should not treat it in that way. It is in the burial club. Instances of the most culpable neglect, if not of greater some statements of the proposed to enter a child into his club and to pay the weekly premium alternately. Upon inquiring as to the relation subsisting between the two young women and the child, he learned that the infant was placed at nurse with the mother of one of these young women. The wife of a clergyman told me that, visiting a poor district just when a child's death had occurred, instead of hearing from the neighbours the language of sympathy for the bereaved parent, she was shocked by such observations as, it's a fine thing for the mother. The child's in 2 clubs. As regards one town, I possess some evidence of the amount of burial club membership and of infant mortality. I do not name the town because, as no actual burial club murders are known to have been committed in it, and as such clubs are not more patronised there than in any other place, it is perhaps not fair to hold it up to particular animadversion. Indeed, as to there are 12 or 14 in the town, mustering offer no consequence. Are more numerous than entire mass, old and according to the statement of a leading death list officer, 3/4 of the names on these catalogues of the doomed are the names of children. Now, if this be the truth, and I believe it is, hundreds, if not thousands of children must be entered each into 4 or 5 or even 12 clubs, their chances of life diminishing, of course, in proportion to the frequency with which they are entered.
Lest you should imagine that such excessive addiction to burial clubs is only to be found in one place, I furnish you with a report for 1846 of a single club which then boasted 34,100 members, the entire population of the town to which it belongs having been, in 1841, little more than 36,000.